Welcome to our new leadership series where we feature global technology leaders, both in Ireland and across the world. This episode we feature Philip Reynolds, who's had a fascinating career in many different leadership roles, and he gives us some great insights how he went on his own personal journey of becoming a great senior leader.
So Philip, you founded a company 21 years ago out of college called RFC Networks. Tell me about how that experience shaped your life.
Yeah, I think owning a business and being responsible ultimately for, the money that's coming in that has to pay the bills, and being very close to that in terms of, the intersection of sales ultimately and and the work being delivered. I think you take that ownership mentality into a lot of other roles. I think you put yourself into the shoes of a business owner, and without being super intentional about it, I think I kind of showed up with that mindset. If I was an owner, what would I want me to do? Right. That's what I was thinking each and every time that a job would come my way. And that ownership mentality, I does think kind of lead naturally into, leadership roles, taking more ownership, taking initiative. And so while they can be often cliches when we say that's what we're looking for, I think every role to some degree, has some element of that people are looking for. I think, when you're placed in that situation where you really need to operate as an owner at a young age, but quite frankly, in one of your first kind of, full-time jobs as well, I think it's hard to kind of remove yourself from that mentality when you're working for other people and you realize, you're privileged to get a paycheck every month, and that you're working for an organization that, is predictable, and you're working for yourself. There's unpredictability there. I think you try and reward that predictability by trying to do the right thing ultimately for the business and for the owner.
When you talk about them sort of early years and you're looking at that, I guess always been tuned into sort of personal growth and self-discovery. So what did that journey look like for you, even from the early years, and how did that, I guess, translate then into becoming a great leader?
Yeah, I think my personal growth was probably more focused around hard skills in the early days. I was a teenager who loved spending time in front of a computer. I brought that into university. I brought that into every role that I was in. I always was passionate about knowing more about, what I was doing. It was probably only in my kind of later years. I mean, I took on some management responsibility, and it was through my later years getting kind of some executive coaching that there was really more of a personal journey, I think, of kind of discovery, right? When you realize, you think you're better than you are, right? And when it comes down to people management, a lot of the hard skills don't necessarily translate across. And I think once you start to realize, it's like, okay, this, kind of what got me here won't necessarily get me there. If I want to become a better leader over time, and I want to accelerate or catalyze, that journey that I'm on, how do I get better? And so I was kind of privileged enough to go through some executive coaching. I think, that really gets you to pause and ask some real reflective questions. I think, I was on probably, a journey with, marriage and kids. That's, there's a lot of stress and everything else that comes with that. And so for me, those formative stages were very much just about in the trenches, getting work done, right? If I want to call that kind of the first 10 years of my career, that was just getting better at the hard skills, at the things that I was, that I could see in front of me that I could do. And I think probably maybe the second 10 years of my career has been more around that kind of personal journey. That idea of, okay, you can have the best hard skills in the world, but, if you want to show up as a leader really for a group of people, in some ways, I personally very strongly believe that means developing as an individual, developing as what I would call an adult. So I know, strictly speaking, we're considered adults when we can vote, and out of college, I'm an adult when I get into a full-time job. But my definition of that now is probably very different than it was in my 20s, and that journey for me was certainly very much a journey of as much of personal growth as it was of professional, and I see the two very interlinked.
What about sport, though? I know you're a big sporting man. You've always played in different teams, and you have a great interest in lots of varieties of sport. Specifically to that, then, how did that translate into leadership, engineering, being part of a team? Tell me a bit about that, please.
Yeah, I played a huge amount of sport when I was a kid. Most of it, certainly in my teenage years, I guess, was kind of revolved around teams, or whether it was soccer, Gaelic football, basketball, so there's a team dynamic there. And I think, because I played a wide variety of sports, and then because, I moved to college, I moved to Dublin, I got exposed to a lot of different teams, and obviously every team you work on and work, you're exposed into teams there as well. But probably the number of teams I was exposed to in my early 20s is probably more than your average person. And I think, you're on winning teams, you're on losing teams. I mean, most of the teams I think most of us play on over time are not winning teams, right? Even the ones that do win in one year, lose the next. And you start to kind of pattern match a little bit through the dynamics of, what makes a team successful. And, over time, you realize it's not having, the 5, 10, 15 best players that absolutely exist, and that, teams of people that maybe on paper shouldn't win can. And there's this kind of soft, intangible dynamic that exists within teams that's very hard to put your finger on. And so therefore, when you become in charge of teams, you start to ask the question of, well, how do I construct this? When you're in a team, maybe you think about it a little bit less. There's you can kind of feel it, but you're not necessarily thinking about the composition or construction as much. You're just thinking about, how do I do my job? But then once you're in a position where you're now in charge of construction or composition, so the coach's equivalent, managing a team and a job, now you're thinking about, what does a high performing team look like here, and how do we win? And the interesting thing about business is that, it's not as black and white. In a sports, sports is fairly zero sum, right? Like there's two teams competing against each other. I win, you lose, or vice versa. In the business context, it's harder to really get a feedback on, are you winning or losing, or what's the equivalent in that context. And so, the sports metaphor, I'm always really careful about, like not to bring it too far. I think those can wear fairly thin, but I do believe that it gives you that sense and feeling of, it's not just about putting together the best group of individuals, and there's a gel and dynamic that has to happen, and the balance composition is something that's worth thinking through. And then for me, I learned how to play in a team, right? And I think all of us, even in what we would consider some of the most individual journeys that we're on, we're typically surrounded by people. And so, very basic things like, how do you play without the ball? Those are things that, people can struggle with. And I think, those formative years, playing in teams, I think for me gave me a better sense of how to show up in a team environment in a workplace, and felt quite natural to me in a way that, might have taken others, I think, longer time and longer journey to get through.
Just to expand a little bit on that, though, I'm particularly interested around the habits and the different behaviors. And then you, I guess, as a leader, being showing those behaviors, leading from the front in relation to that. Like, how did you really get that right as a manager, as a senior manager, particularly in a scaling software business?
Yeah, I think like there's a little bit of a journey there as well. Oftentimes, rightly or wrongly, a lot of times, as an individual contributor, if you like, as someone who's focused on, frontline work. So in a software world, maybe that's kind of writing software. What gets you often into the management role maybe is being, a high performing individual contributor and having some soft skills and some gel with the team, right? And then, so you kind of tend to default to leading from the front, like, just leading by doing and knowing the job well. But that has to evolve over time. If you want to become a general, manager of an organization that, that you don't have, you couldn't do the job of the individuals in it. Now you've got to evolve your skill set a little bit, right? And so that kind of lead from the front, muck in, I know the job really well, and I can kind of work with the team and kind of construct the team and, put together the work and the delivery aspects of it. That becomes really important. And then as you evolve, you've got to nearly abstract yourself away from that, right? Like, what are the things here that are the same, kind of controlling for the actual work itself. And so, I mean, I don't know that I could, necessarily manage a group of marketers particularly well, but when it comes to, I would say, a group of engineers delivering things, that's something there where you can kind of take some of the common aspects of that, abstract it out a little bit. And then the people leadership side, I mean, is about people, right? And so when you think about what's the job composed of, that ability to hopefully inspire people, that ability to work with people one-on-one, the ability to kind of navigate through an organization and, drive your organization's agenda, but also drive the organization's agenda within your own organization. That kind of dynamic, I think, is pretty much common across all roles. And so when you get down to like, what is leadership within the context of business, a lot of the same jobs are happening just in slightly different functions basically across the business. And so how you show up as an individual, for the business, how you show up as a leader for your organization, and then how do you show up as a teammate for your immediate team? And so, some people talk about this as kind of managing up, managing out, managing down. I like that kind of framing of, being a teammate, right, to your peers, being, a leader and an individual ultimately for the business that can, put things on their shoulders and drive them forward. Being, a good teammate for your boss, and then leading your own organization. And at times leading your own organization means being a teammate to the people in there as well. And so that, for me, the construction of that, some of those things I take from different experiences that I've had. The sports one certainly feeds into how do you be a good teammate, and at times then, where do you need to be maybe aggressive and be, where you're strong and confident that you can show up and you're the right individual to do something. How do you kind of drive that forward in a business context as well?
Philip, I want to chat about the future. You've decided after, was it 11 and a half years, is it? 12 years nearly?
11 and a half years, basically, yeah.
You've already referenced this, working across multiple roles in, a global, incredible company that is Workday. You've decided, obviously, to take a leap of faith and take a slightly unusual path, if you're to compare to many other people in similar positions. Tell us about that. What is it?
Yeah, I think for the next stage of this journey, well, maybe if I kind of take a step back, I guess, and talk about, maybe where that started. I mean, I started a business when I was much younger. I think for me, that became, an itch I wanted to scratch. And so this idea of, do I want to get to my 50s or 60s and, not have given it another go? I kind of feel like certainly I've progressed skill set wise and ability wise, since, the early days of me starting something. So I think that, there's kind of the why, which is like, look, there was an itch that I needed to scratch. I really had gotten to a certain stage where if I felt like I didn't make the move now, it was going to just be increasingly harder to make it. I think the unconventional path that I'm planning to take around kind of acquiring a business as opposed to starting, with the seed of idea and growing it. I think that's really a choice around, look, where am I strong? And so if I did my own kind of personal assessment about, what am I good at? I think I've built a skill set now over 10 years around kind of operating that makes me extremely strong in that area. And to some degree, going back and starting something from scratch again, I've lost some of the hard skills, right, that it takes to go and do that. And so, yeah, could I spend some time figuring that out? Maybe. But for me, I think, I could talk about sustainability a lot, and I don't necessarily mean that in the context of like climate change, but sustainability in terms of, everything that you do, right? Like whether it be, how you're able to, get through your work week, right? People work at varying different levels of effort, but are you working on a sustainable pace that you can sustain over 10, 15, 20 years? And what does that look like? And it will ebb and flow, but that idea of kind of managing over the long term. And so for me, buying a business really is about, how do I create kind of a sustainable way for me to get energy from what I do. I love my job. I love what I do. And I want and kind of feel like I need, if you like, the competitive drive of owning something, but I want to do that in a way that's ultimately going to be sustainable over a long time. And so while it's a little bit of an alternative path, the kind of the risk profile should be a little bit less than starting a venture-backed business, just because there's an existing customer base, there's an existing market, and then really what I'm doing is backing my own skills as an operator to be able to come in and operate that business, and to be able to construct a team over time, to be able to build that business. And so hopefully the theory is that I'm leaning into the strengths that I know I'm good at, and that will pay off over a longer time. This isn't a kind of a buy and flip it strategy. This is really a buy and hold type of thing where, I plan to come in, operate a business, grow it, and back myself as a leader. And so that really was the bet. And the more I thought about, look, if I'm going to go and do something myself, what way would I do it? I felt like, look, leaning into my strengths was going to give me the best ability to get an outcome and honestly also give me the most energy as I go through my day. So rather than, you know, starting from absolutely zero, maybe I'm starting a little bit further on. And I know I love what I do, and therefore, you know, I'll hopefully be able to bring that energy every day and every week into the new venture.
Many people, though, Philip, I guess, resist, you know, that burning desire to scratch that itch, as you refer to. You know, but ultimately, it's about pursuing a passion that you genuinely believe in, and clearly energizes you, as you already referenced. But most people don't, right, due to fear, and in many cases, you know, when they're a bit further on in life, they do live to regret it. Tell me and help me understand, please, particularly for people with ambition who will be looking at this and listening to you speak. How did you, I guess, make peace with that decision? And help me understand that kind of psychological journey that you went through, please.
Yeah, and you know, ultimately there is a jump moment, you know, and that, you know, I've got a small book that I read to my kids. It's about a little penguin that has to jump into the water, right? And there's a moment, I think, where people think about, you know, people talk about bravery or whatever, and you know, I think we throw that word around a lot, and bravery, when like you're kind of conditioned to do something, it doesn't feel particularly brave. A lot of people, you know, to do certain things, you know, and I think, you know, bravery really is, to be honest, a lot of the time making the jump when there's a kind of an unknown element to it, and really pushing through the fear. And there's certainly an element of fear, I think, anytime, you know, you go and do this. Ultimately, I mean, there was a, you know, I'm an engineer by trade, so I'm probably overly rational, right? So the first thing I try and do whenever I've got some of these big emotional, you know, decisions to make is just make sure that I'm thinking through the rationalization, right? And so at least that I can rationally explain it to myself, to talk myself off the cliff. And the basic framework, right? I think Jeff Bezos calls it the kind of, you know, regret minimization framework, right? Which is that if I'm 55 or 60 and I'm kind of, you know, at the end or coming towards the end of my career, am I going to regret trying and failing more than I'm going to regret staying and never trying? And, you know, even if I would find it hard to put myself in that situation, I generally think that most people would, you know, the conventional wisdom, at least anyway, is like trying and failing is less regrettable than never trying at all. And so that's certainly the case for me. And so that was the very first conversation that I have with myself, which is, okay, well, that's the reason to go do this. And so, you know, and I know very personally, I suppose at this stage is like, I don't want to be really carrying that baggage with me for the next 20 years. And so, you know, in some ways, I think people would look and say, you're very brave. And I'm like, no, actually, it's the opposite. I'm like, I'm absolutely petrified that I'm going to wake up every day for the next 30 years and be like, why didn't I go and do that when I could, right? And so that was probably number one, which is that whole entire thought process of, you know, how do I make sure I don't wake up every day and you know, and have this going through my head? You know, I've got an itch that I really want to scratch, and you know, that needs to be done. You know, I think the second thing really was, I still think there's a huge misnomer around, you know, the kind of this risk-taking entrepreneur, and I kind of always use this story around kind of Richard Branson. You know, as like the stereotypical entrepreneur, started so many businesses, but when he started Virgin Airlines, basically, you know, he took on a massive bet, but he did it in a way that allowed him to kind of reduce risk, basically by, you know, getting things into the contracts that allowed him to hand one of his biggest expenses, the planes, essentially back to the operators, right? And so I think there's ways to think about, you know, what I call these kind of barbell strategies, which is complementing high risk decisions with low risk decisions. And so, you know, rather than kind of trying to tread down the middle path, you know, if you're investing money, for example, if you're investing in really high risk, you know, asset classes over here, you try and balance or complement that with low risk over there. And so maybe just to bring that back to a very personal decision, you know, some of that just came down to really basics like savings. You know, I made some of those decisions over a long period of time, which is that, look, I think I'm going to want to go out and do this. So it's going to be really important for me to have a bank of savings and a bank of money that I can put aside that, you know, keeps the mortgage paid, et cetera, for a couple of years. And so, you know, for me, but I think that barbell strategy is a really interesting framework to put things through. Because I think that middle ground, you know, the kind of metaphorical cut the baby in half, right? And no one's ever happy. This idea of kind of complementary kind of risk profiles. If you're going to do something very high risk over here, how can you de-risk that outcome, or how can you complement or, you know, balance that risk profile by maybe being conservative in this other area. And so this is obviously an extremely high risk decision for me in terms of this could all go up in flames, and, you know, like the risk of no income and lots of other things are there. And then, you know, but I'm complementing that to some degree with like, look, I've been saving money ultimately, I guess, in a very practical way. And then maybe the third element of it is the kind of psychology, right? So this kind of fear of failure, fear of looking like a bit of an idiot, right? Fear of embarrassment. You know, you've got a big job and in a company that's doing well. And then, you know, so that's what you can tell people when you're at the golf course or when you go meet them at a dinner, right? And then you're going from that into this kind of very risky venture. I think everyone looks at that a little bit differently. I'd be lying if I said there isn't a little bit of me which doesn't want to fail or you know, doesn't want to fail because I don't want to have to deal with the external, right? Like, oh, I'm really sorry that didn't work out, or having to go back and get a job or whatever it is. But I suppose over time I've tended to find that just jumping into things without overthinking. I'll be honest, how I deal with that, maybe, I don't know, if a professional psychologist might not be, you know, might say I'm repressing a bunch of feelings there, but I tend to jump and think later. And I think sometimes just saying yes and dealing with the consequences later just allows you to kind of push through it. And you know, I left my job. I didn't have a very fixed business that I wanted to buy, and kind of bet on myself. And you know, I didn't get to that place by making big decisions, you know, by just waking up one day and going, well, I'm going to make this huge life decision and you know, just not think it through. But I suppose conditioning yourself over longer periods of time by just saying yes to things, like taking opportunities, I think allows you then to build a muscle that will let you, you know, take a chance and educated guess on something bigger down the line. And so I would say, yeah, even smaller things like kind of weirdly signing up to a triathlon, you know, after a quick conversation with a colleague, you know, never having been in a pool for 15 years and didn't own a bike, right? I was like, okay, there's a triathlon in 3 months' time, you know, it wasn't like a crazy big one, but it was like, right, let's just go, just say yes and figure it out later, right? And if I couldn't figure it out, then so be it. Maybe I'll do one in 6 months or 9 months. But kind of felt like saying yes was the right decision. Ultimately, it's a bunch of exercise. How bad is that? I kind of feel like, you know, if, you know, sometimes there's just this, you know, you can overthink things, and typically overthinking things results in this kind of stagnation, no decision. It's not like you said no or yes. It's kind of like you didn't do anything. And so therefore you default to not doing anything. And so this bias for action, I guess, for me, like if there's something that's really important, I want to make sure that I actually move the ball forward. And the simplest way sometimes to do that is just to say yes and figure it out later.
Did you do the triathlon? Is this past or is this coming?
You've done it already? I did. Yeah. I did, and then I got really into it and did it for a couple of years. Once we our second or third child, there's a rabbit hole. You can go spend as much money and time as you want in that sport, I have to say. But yeah, I did. Yeah. We did it, and it was great. I would advise everyone to do it. By the way, it was a super. And you don't need a huge amount of training, but we had no idea what we were signing up to. You know, when we were doing it, it was just a colleague of mine having a conversation at a desk, and I was like, okay, I don't know what this is, but like, sure, let's just say yes. It was like May, the triathlon was on in August, and yeah, we figured it out. We just about got over the line.
No, I have my first one, full one, next month actually. So it was just funny that you said it, you know. The pool was my nemesis, but
But what advice would you give in terms of building a team, keeping in mind that mentality that you don't necessarily want the top 5 or 10 people, because then you get, you know, a bunch of alphas all try, you know, kind of, you know, a bunch of rutting stags. Talk to me about the dynamic of building a team as a leader from the perspective of, you know, the go alone versus go together approach.
Yeah, and maybe, if you like, I can kind of just tie it back to my own personal journey with that, because that's definitely evolved over time as well. And I think, you know, because I loved computers and what I did, I mean, in the kind of formative stages of, you know, of me developing, if you like, I mean, it really was me about my own individual skill set, right? And, you know, my best version of myself was the person who knew more than the person to the right hand side of me or to the left hand side of me, right? That was what I felt like success looked like. And you know, the team thing really came into the side. You know, I guess it's easy for me to look back now and reflect on the sporting thing, but I thought they had nothing to do with each other, right? That was a thing I did on the weekends, and this was the thing I did during the week. And you know, over time, I think you realize is like, hold on a minute, like, success is inextricably linked to like the group of people that you put together. And turns out now I'm, managing a team, and it turns out like actually, the best, hard skilled individuals or the most talented individuals aren't necessarily, always the best individuals for your team or for this situation. And so that certainly that evolution of the thought process was there. And, that proverb, that was really, even only by 3 or 4 years ago, got introduced to me by an executive coach. And this idea of, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And I think when you think about what a business is, when you think about what a team is, like, it's a marathon, and this is a real cliche, right? But it is a marathon and it's not a sprint. And so, your ability to sustainably hold top line growth year on year is what most businesses are set up to do. And so if that's the case, it doesn't matter what you do tomorrow or next week, you've got to sustainably hold growth quarter over quarter, year over year. And so therefore then now, when you by definition, if you like, a growth business is set up to grow over a long period. I know we make lots of decisions that don't necessarily buy into that are very short-term focused. But sustainable growth over a long period of time, I think most business owners or most CEOs would say that's what they're looking for. And that's what certainly the market is looking for. It's not just about your ability to hit next quarter's numbers. It's about your ability to hit numbers sustainably over a long period of time. So now, I guess if I've kind of convinced you that it is a marathon and it's not a sprint, therefore then now we have to go together, right? And so then that African proverb really does come into play, this idea of, okay, the construction and the dynamic of a team becomes really, really important, right? And so then who are the group of people that you're bringing together? And the big issue really there is that look, there's a lot of intangibles that go into this, and I don't claim to be an expert in team construction, but I think you can feel it. And I think that's a feeling that you can have when you're inside of a team, that there's, I would say a lot of the times the best teams are fun to work on, right? There's a dynamic between the individuals that are there. They're often very fun to manage. There's people who bring a sense of personality to the team. There's people who bring a sense of expertise to the team. There is a level of competition, healthy competition, I think, within the team in terms of that's pushing the team forward. And so, I think you can bring that too far, but I certainly think that idea of we're all there to make each other better, and that, being comfortable isn't necessarily where you want everyone every single day, every minute of every single day. We have to take on challenging things. Challenging helps us learn, challenging helps us grow. And so that idea of, I guess, kind of, some level of composition through personality types. In a work situation, actually, tenure is often a way to do this. Maybe in a sports situation, that might be, senior and junior. You've got younger people who are earlier in their careers that, can be brought on by older people. They can often do, a lot of the heavy lifting work that's required. You've got some senior people there, right? So you've got some kind of diversity in terms of maybe tenure and experience. Diversity of thought is a huge big one as well. Can we have different perspectives? Like, we're in the knowledge business when it comes to technology. Like, we live and die on the ability for us to make kind of, decisions. But the number one thing, and this is well studied, like it's what's called psychological safety within the team, right? If you have team members that, feel like they can speak their mind, and that everyone feels like their voice and opinion is heard. When you're in a team that isn't performing well, it's really obvious, right? Like, but you go home, you tell your spouse, you tell your friends, you tell your brother or sister, whoever it might be, but you are maybe not comfortable saying what's wrong in a team environment. And, Google did a big study, which is like the biggest thing you want ultimately is psychological safety within that team. And the two biggest determinants of that, in my experience, are how the leader shows up, and then the senior people who are on that team. So role modeling that behavior, which is like, there's no topic here that's off topic. And so that team becomes self-regulating ultimately. And once you can put topics on the table, now you're able to improve. And that's all you ever want from a team, that the team is better this week than it is last week, from every single team. Because if you can sustainably make a team better over time, and you can do that, for infinity, the compound effect of that is absolutely massive. And so many teams stagnate due to, personal conflicts or a slightly unsafe environment, or whatever it might be. And when I say unsafe, that maybe I don't mean that they feel often physically unsafe. It's just that there's certain topics that are taboo. Don't push back on the manager, don't annoy that individual on the team. And so that actually, for me, the reason why some of those personal dynamics are so important and so healthy is because they allow you to put the topics on the table that might be controversial. And then they actually allow the team to improve. And with what goes unsaid in relationships, in marriages, in teams, that kills the team, because you can't move on from something if there's this kind of unspoken, kind of convention of, well, we don't talk about that thing. But isn't that the most important thing? Or, well, we, don't talk about that. And then like the new people coming into the team learn these behaviors and conventions as well, as opposed to walking into an environment where everyone's focused on getting better. And when something comes up, it can be addressed, it can be put on the table, and then the team as a unit, as opposed to an individual, can move forward. And now you have your steps where the team can improve. And so, that's my kind of, I guess, maybe take on it, but certainly psychological safety is what you're looking for. That ultimately comes down to team compositions, leadership, and the team dynamics, and that ability, I think, to put things on the table that are really important.
Thank you very much for watching this episode of our leadership series. We will see you in a couple of weeks for our next episode.
Hatfield Green. Nothing is impossible.